Well, there's that story again. If you're familiar with the church year, you can always count on this Sunday being the Sunday of Thomas. Thomas the twin. And the story of Thomas is really kind of fascinating because he wasn't there. We don't know really what he was doing at the first time Jesus shows up. And the disciples are all excited. They tell Thomas about this when he finally shows up. And Thomas kind of almost throws this little bit of a fit, like, well, if I don't put my fingers in his hands and I don't put my hand in his side, I'm not going to believe any of this stuff because it's just too much of a story. Okay, Thomas. Then when the next week comes around and Jesus comes in again, peace be with you, there's Thomas. Jesus says, hey, Thomas, come here. Put your fingers in my hands, hand in my side. And Thomas can't even move because he's just overtaken by this whole thing. And my Lord, my God. Jesus touches Thomas' life. It isn't so much about Thomas touching Jesus. It's about Jesus touching Thomas and changed his life completely. With his presence, with the physical touch, with the words, he touched Thomas. And touch is just a fascinating thing. Because it can be physical. We can have a handshake or holding someone's hand or a hand on somebody's shoulder, comforting them, or a hug, or all kinds of things like that. And I don't know, when I was putting this together, my thought about touching someone went to football. You ever played football? Some of you have. And the thought, we didn't play touch football, but there was a degree of touching involved. And I still remember I used to play middle linebacker, and there was this notorious fullback on another team, and we kind of met in the hole one day, and they said they heard the crash way on the sidelines, and I stopped him. He probably had a story about how he got away from me, but there's all kinds of physical touch. Then there's the touch of words, just as powerful as that physical touch. You can think about the words that have been spoken to you over your lifetime. You remember certain words. I remember certain words that people spoke to me from years and years ago. They did change my life. They were significant to me at that time. And you might remember all the wonderful compliments. We usually don't remember compliments. We remember the other kind of things. And I was thinking about whose words really touched people. And of course, Billy Graham passed away, a few weeks ago?
21st to be exact,
okay, thank you.
February.
Okay,
Not
cool.
quite the century mark, but...
But just imagine the number of people that were touched by his words. And he would, of course, say, they weren't my words, they were God's words. But I thought just as important as a pastor maybe that was out in Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, out there in the middle of miles and miles and miles of miles and miles. And she has touched how many lives out there? Her words just as important as Billy Graham's, and just as powerful because they had the Word of God mixed in with them. So there's physical, there's words, and there's also presence. And you don't think of that as touching someone. Someone there that's just there. There's a story that I heard this in assembly in front of all God's people. So, okay. this gentleman, the speaker, was talking about his parents. Now they grew up on a farm out in, I think it was in Minnesota somewhere. And he said, Dad would drive, Mom would always sit right next to him. And very seldom did they ever say a word to each other while they were driving. So I guess in his 20s he finally thought about that and he asked Dad, well, I always saw you and I still see you just sitting next to each other when you're driving and no words, not anything. And he says, well, why is that? And he said, well, if she's not there, I feel naked. And of course, he said he had to get that thought out of his head, and then he finally realized it was presence. They were present to each other, just sitting there. And I know through counseling, a lot of times in very nasty situations, sometimes just being there, how powerful that is, the presence of another human being, just sitting there. And you can be touching their life without saying a word. So, there are many ways to touch people, and we kind of have this, I always think of this kind of this circle around us, that as we move through life, we're always touching people by our presence and our words and all of this. So, there was the touching. Well, what was Jesus touching Thomas with? He was touching him with, peace be with you. Peace be with you. It's interesting that this shows up here toward or after the resurrection, because the story actually of Jesus starts out, where's that name of that town? Bethlehem, I think it is, you know?
Yeah, thank you.
So it's kind of like bookends. The peace the angels spoke of, and now Jesus speaks of that same peace. Well, you can think of peace. When you think about peace, my thought always goes to some nice spot, let's say Santa Monica. Santa Monica has this rock outcrop into the ocean. You can just sit there and you can listen to the waves just crashing in and get almost mesmerized by that. Or maybe it's up in the mountains somewhere, nice little stream with the birds singing and the clouds and all of that. Y'all feel peaceful now? Well, that kind of peace is what we're talking about, but in a relationship with another someone. And to be at peace, there cannot be anything interfering. Being at peace means it's completely open to each other, with nothing negative in between. Now, it's interesting because Jesus comes to the disciples. And if there's anybody that could be angry at someone, Jesus could have been angry at the disciples, because when he was arrested, what did the disciples do? They just disappeared into the night as fast as they could go. And Peter even denies that he even knows this man. He just, nothing to do with him. So you'd think Jesus would almost come and give them a lecture. But what does he do? Peace be with you. He removed any obstacle in the relationship he had with the disciples. He was at peace with them completely. Now, I'm sure you have relationships. And some of them are really nice and peaceful. I have a very peaceful relationship with my neighbors down in Cathedral City. They have been there forever, 20 years, 40 years, and 30 years. And we watch each other's houses when people aren't around, and we know each other. I've had some relationships with people, sad to say, in churches that weren't so peaceful. But, well, that's another story. So, are you at peace with yourself? Do you like yourself? That's always a fun question. Everybody gets this kind of look on their face. Because we're notorious for wanting to change who we are. All you have to do is look into the media, into the internet or TV or that. All kinds of interesting diets and exercise programs and all kinds of things going on that you can change really who you are. But in the midst of that, did you ever think of how much Jesus changes you? How Jesus touches your life and brings that peace. Well, how about the relationship that you have with God? Does God kind of meet all of your standards and fulfillments and all of this? Do you think God does a pretty good job? Well, I didn't get much comment out of that. So, about our relationship with God, how about God? Well, what does God think of each one of us? That's another good question. We kind of sometimes don't think that much of ourselves because, like I said about the changing. But any time that we mention that to God, Jesus says, don't worry about that, that's taken care of. But what about this? Oh, that's taken care of. Don't worry about it. Well, I did, well, that's taken care of. Don't worry about it. That's what the peace means. When Jesus says, peace be with you, that's what that means. That anything that would interfere with our relationship with God is taken out of there by Jesus dying on the cross. So we can be at complete peace with Jesus, with God. And we have been touched so many times through the water and through the bread and the wine that we will partake of in a minute. And we're touched by people, by words, by the presence of Jesus. So what does that get us? We are filled with the peace that Jesus brings to us. So that enables us possibly to see ourselves in a different way, to be at peace at who we are, that we are God's creation, and to be at peace with those around us, those close to us, to not anything get in the way of those relationships, to be at peace with those around us, and to touch people's lives that we don't know. We touch people's lives anyway. Remember that circle of presence and all of that I was talking about? We do touch people's lives anyway. Why not touch them with the love of Jesus, the peace of Jesus? And of course, what binds it all together, since Easter was just last week, and well, every week is a little Easter, we have to talk about Jesus rising from the dead. That first Easter morning, to be present to us, to touch our lives with that peace. Jesus speaks to us, peace be with you. And all we can say is, my Lord